Wyvern Park, in the county of Rutland. The Great Hall, paving, stair and screen. Ketton stone, worked and set by Josiah Musgrave, mason of Ketton in the said county, by articles under seal dated the 9th day of April, 1811. Measured on the ground and entered fair by his hand. Paving of the hall, in squares rubbed and jointed, 411 feet superficial. The great stair, in steps moulded and returned, 43 risers, 594 feet run. The screen of 6 columns, wrought and polished, with their bases, plinths and caps, 380 feet. Chimney piece, hall, carved with the shell and swag, 91 feet. Chimney piece, saloon, plain moulded, 62 feet. Sundry landings, sills, thresholds and copings, 402 feet. Sum of the measure, 2,140 feet. Rates as per schedule annexed. Received on account, 3 payments. Balance due at the foot. That was the whole of it. 9 lines of a mason's hand in a book 8 inches by 5, bound in sheepskin gone the color of weak tea, ruled down the middle in faded red ink, and carried for 4 years afterwards in a work basket beneath a governess's mending. There was no complaint in it. There was no grievance in it. It was only a measure, taken as a measure is taken, in feet and inches and quarter inches, by a man who had never in his life put down a figure he could not prove with a rod. Lavinia Musgrave was 24 that spring, and she had kept the book since she was 19. She kept it the way other young women of her age and situation kept a workbox or a hymnal, not as a relic but as a thing in use. On the inner cover her father had written the alphabet of his rates in his own shorthand, and beneath that in a rounder and more careful hand that was hers, the dates on which she had gone up to Wyvern Park with a 2-foot rule in her pocket, and finished what he had not lived to finish. There were 19 such dates. Mrs. Hibbert the housekeeper had let her in at the garden door on every one of them, had stood with her arms folded at the foot of the stair while the girl went up and down it on her knees, and had said nothing to anybody in the house, because there had been nobody in the house that year to say it to. Netherwold lay 2 miles east of the park gates, a village of grey gold cottages, a duck pond, a smithy, and the church of St. Chad, with its stumpy Norman tower. The stone of the cottages, the stone of the church, the stone of the pond's coping, and the stone of the great hall 2 miles off had all come out of the same ground at Ketton, and Lavinia had been born within sound of the saws that cut it. Her father's yard had stood at the corner, where the Stamford road turned. Her earliest recollection was of the noise of the banker chisels, 4 and 5 of them at once, each at a different pitch, and of the white dust that lay on the hedge in summer like a light fall of snow that never melted. Josiah Musgrave had not been a gentleman, and had never pretended to be one. He had been a master mason of the old sort, apprenticed at 14, free of his craft at 21, and by 40 he was the man the county sent for when a thing was to be done that could not be done twice. He had a chest of drawings he could not have explained in words, and a memory for the bed of a stone that other men wrote down and still got wrong. He had married above himself, and had known it, and had made no fuss about it. Hester Musgrave had been the daughter of a clergyman at Uppingham, had brought him £100, a shelf of books, and a manner of speaking that her daughter afterwards inherited entire, and had died of a fever when Lavinia was 11, leaving behind her the books, the manor, and an instruction that the child was to be taught properly or not at all. So Lavinia had been taught properly. She had French from a Frenchwoman lodged at Stamford, who had come over in the emigration and taught for her bread. She had the globes and the use of them. She had a hand fit for a letter of business. And she had from her father, and without either of them ever calling it teaching, the whole grammar of worked stone. She could tell freestone from ragstone by the sound of a knuckle on it. She could tell rubbed work from scaffold work across a room. She knew what a mason meant when he said a stone was tender, and what he meant when he said it was hungry, and she knew the difference between a molded foot and a foot superficial in a bill, which is a distinction that has emptied more purses than gambling. Above all, she could read marks. Every man who had ever cut a stone in that district cut his own mark into the bedface of it, where it would be buried in the joint and seen by nobody until the building fell down. The marks were not signatures. They were the way a banker mason claimed his day's work when the measure was taken, and every one of them was as distinct as a handwriting, and 100 years of them lay hidden in the joints of every church between Stamford and Oakham. Her father's mark was a chevron with a bar across the point, cut deep and always in the same corner. Emma's Cardwell's was a double loop. Old Follett's was 3 nicks and a hook. Simeon Trigg, who had been apprenticed the year Lavinia turned 12, cut a crooked T with the cross-stroke sloped, because he had never once in his life managed to hold a chisel level. She had learned them at the age when other children learn the names of birds, and she had never forgotten one. That was the whole of her accomplishment, and it was not an accomplishment that could be shown in a drawing room, and for the greater part of her life it had been worth exactly nothing to her at all. The articles of the 9th of April, 1811, were between Sir Everard Danby, Baronet, of Wyvern Park in the county of Rutland, of the one part, and Josiah Musgrave, mason, of Ketton in the same county, of the other part. They were engrossed on 2 skins of vellum by a clerk in the office of Mr. Locksley at Stamford, in a round black hand with the first word in a flourish. And they were indented at the head in the old way, the 2 parts cut apart along a wavy line, so that each would answer to the other if ever a question came. Sir Everard took one part. Her father took the other, folded it in 4, and put it in the tin box in the yard office with his freedom papers and his mother's marriage lines, and there it had stayed. What the articles said, in the way such things say it, was this: that the said Josiah Musgrave should work, prepare and set the paving, stair, screen, chimney pieces and sundries of the new hall at Wyvern, of Ketton stone from the beds at the upper quarry, in a workmanlike manner, and to the satisfaction of the surveyor, that the work should be measured on the ground when finished, and paid for by measure, at the rates in the schedule annexed, that payments might be made on account from time to time, as the work went forward, upon the certificate of the surveyor, and that the said Sir Everard Danby, for himself, his heirs, executors and administrators, did covenant with the said Josiah Musgrave, his executors, administrators, and assigns, to pay the balance so ascertained within 6 calendar months of the measure, for himself, his heirs, executors, and administrators. 7 words in 100 lines, in the middle of a page, in a hand so regular that the eye went over them like water over a stone. The work began in the summer of 11, and went forward for 3 years. It was the largest thing her father ever did, and it very nearly killed him. There were 2 winters in it, when he came home at 7 in the evening, and sat down in his coat and had to be spoken to twice before he heard. Sir Everard came out to look at it every few weeks, an old man in a bottle green coat with a stick, and stood in the mess with his hat on, and once said of a column that had been 3 months in the working, that it was the only honest thing anybody had done for him in 20 years. He paid 3 sums on account, £200 in the November of 11, 500 in the June of 12, and 800 in the August of 13. Her father entered each of them in the book on the day it came, with the initials of the clerk who brought it. The hall was finished, all but the setting of the last landing sill and the grouting of the loose step at the turn, in the autumn of 1815. The measure was never formally taken, because on the 9th of November of that year Sir Everard Danby was found by his valet to have died in the night in his own bed, sitting up against the bolster with his spectacles still on, and a book of engravings open on the counterpane. And the house went into black, and everything in it stopped. Josiah Musgrave went to the funeral in a borrowed coat, and stood at the back. He came home and said only that the old gentleman had gone easily, which is more than most get. He was not troubled. The debt was a debt under seal, and the covenant bound the heir, and Mr. Locksley had told him so in the yard office in his own words. There was no hurry. He would take the measure in the spring, when the house had settled and the new man had found his feet, and the thing would be paid as such things were always paid. He died himself on the 22nd of February following, of an inflammation of the lungs taken standing in the wet at Ketton to see a load of stone off the wagon, in the 51st year of his age, leaving 1 daughter, a yard, a tin box, and an unmeasured haul. Lavinia was 19. She buried him beside her mother in the churchyard at Ketton on a morning of thin rain, and sold the yard 3 weeks afterwards, because a yard is worth nothing without the man in it, and the tools went for less than the wagon. When everything was reckoned there, remained to her, after the last of his people had been paid their wages to the day, about £90 and the furniture of 2 rooms. She did not weep at the sale. Mrs. Cardwell, who was Amos's wife and had known her since she was in short frocks, told half the parish afterwards that it was unnatural in a girl and would come out somewhere. But it did not come out anywhere. Lavinia had wept in February, in the room upstairs, twice thoroughly, with the door shut, and having done so she found that she had no further use for it, and put it away as her father had put away a chisel he had finished with. What she did instead was this. On the Tuesday after the sale she walked the 4 miles to Wyvern Park, went in at the garden door, asked for Mrs. Hibbert, and requested leave to measure the hall. Mrs. Hibbert was a woman of 55, with iron grey hair under a linen cap, and 31 years of that house behind her, and she had been at the funeral. She looked at the girl for a while, and then said, "Does anybody know you are come?" "No, ma'am." "Then you had better be quick, and you had better not come Tuesdays, because Tuesdays the steward is in the house." So it was Thursdays, and it was 19 Thursdays spread over 4 years, because a governess's afternoons are not her own, and because the whole of it had to be done with a 2-foot rule and a line, on her knees, by a person who was not to be seen doing it. She measured the paving square by square, and cast it up at home. She measured the stair riser by riser, and the mouldings of every step girt round the profile with a strip of tape, which is the only honest way, and the way her father had taught her. She measured the columns of the screen, and the caps and the bases. She measured the chimney piece in the hall with the shell and the swag, which took 2 afternoons on account of the carving, and the plain one in the saloon, which took 20 minutes. She measured every sill, threshold and coping in the sundries. And when she had done, she entered it all fair in the sheepskin book under her father's 9 lines, in her own rounder hand, and cast the sum. 2,140 feet. Then she wrote the balance at the foot, in figures and in words, as her father had taught her a bill should be written, and ruled it off, and shut the book, and put it in the work-basket under the mending, and went on with her life. The 19 Thursdays deserve an account of their own, because they were the whole of what she did with 4 years, and because nobody in the county knew about a single one of them until it was over. The first was in the April of 1816, 6 weeks after her father was buried, when she was 19, and had not yet got the situation at Netherwold Grange, and was living in 2 rooms at Ketton, on the wreck of the sail. She walked over in the morning, went in at the garden door, and did the paving of the hall, which is the simplest part of any such measure, and the part where a person who has never taken one alone finds out whether she can. The house was empty. Mr. Danby was in Bath until the June. The shutters were up in the saloon, the furniture was in Holland covers, and there were 4 servants in the whole of it. The hall was cold in the way that only a stone hall shut up in April is cold, and the light came down from the tall window over the landing in one grey column, and her breath showed. She took her father's 2-foot rule out of her pocket and knelt down on the first square inside the door, and found that her hands were not steady enough to hold the rule true, and knelt there for perhaps 2 minutes until they were. Then she measured the paving of the great hall at Wyvern Park, square by square, in her morning gown, alone, and got up when it was done with her knees numb and her hem grey to the shin, and walked 4 miles home, and cast it up at the kitchen table by candlelight, and made it 411 feet superficial, and then, because she did not trust herself the first time, went back on the 2nd Thursday and did the whole of it again, and made it 411 feet superficial. That was the day she understood that she was going to be able to do it. The 3rd and 4th Thursdays were the screen, 6 columns with their bases, plinths and caps, which are tedious because a cap must be girt round its profile with a tape, and the tape will not lie in the hollows, and because the shafts are polished and show every mark of a thumb. She wore cotton gloves after the 3rd Thursday for that reason, and it slowed her by a 1/3, and she wore them anyway. The 5th was rain, and she got as far as the lodge and turned back. Because there is no measuring in wet shoes on polished stone. A person who does that falls, and a person who falls in that house alone in 1816 lies there. By the 6th she had the situation at the Grange, and everything altered. A governess has Sunday afternoon and 1/2 day, and hers was Thursday, and a 1/2 day is 4 hours if the walk is not counted, and 2 if it is. From the 6th Thursday to the 19th she measured Wyvern Park in stolen hours, in a borrowed gig when Mr. Locke's cousin was going that way, and on her own feet when he was not. The 6th 7th and 8th were the stair, 43 risers, each with its moulded nosing and its return, each girt with tape, each entered on the slate first, and in the book afterwards, and the whole of it done from the bottom up with her back to the hall, so that she would have heard anybody coming through the door long before they saw her face. Mrs. Hibbert brought her tea on the 7th, in the housekeeper's own china, and stood over her while she drank it. You will make yourself ill. I am perfectly well, ma'am. You are 19 years of age, and you are crawling about a stone floor in the winter for a man who is dead, said Mrs. Hibbert. I have said my piece. Drink that while it is hot. The 9th Thursday was the step at the turn. She had left it deliberately, because it frightened her, and by the 9th she had run out of things to do that did not. The last flight had never been finished. The sill of the upper landing was set but not pointed, and the step at the turn had been bedded temporarily on 2 slate packings to keep the flight passable through the winter of 15, with the permanent bedding and the grouting left for the spring that never came. She knew, because she had been in the yard office when her father talked about it, sitting on the step of the door with her mending, being 16 and not attending and hearing every word, that he had cut his mark and the quarry's mark and the date into the bed of that step, and that it was the only stone in the building where the 3 stood together, and that he had done it because it was the last stone of the largest job of his life. The trouble was that the step weighed about 400 weight, and she was 5 feet 4 inches high. Mrs. Hibbert came and looked at it with her arms folded, and said that it could not be done. Then she went away, and came back with the coal shovel, the poker, the parlor fire irons, and a folded hearthrug, and the 2 of them spent the better part of an hour on their knees at the turn of the great stair, levering, packing, resting, and levering again, with the housekeeper saying at intervals that she would be turned off for this, and did not care, and the girl saying nothing at all. And at 4:30, in the failing light, with the rug rucked under it and both of them on the landing above pulling, the step came up on its edge and stood, and leaned against the balusters like a door. The bed face came up rough and pale gold out of the dark, and there in the corner was the chevron with the bar across the point, cut deep and clean, 1.5 inches across, and beside it the quarry's mark, and under them the date. Lavinia Musgrave knelt on the landing of another man's staircase, and looked at her father's handwriting for a long time. She did not weep then, either. What she did was take out of her pocket a scrap of paper and a stub of lead, and lay the paper over the marks, and rub it flat and slow the way he had taught her at 11 years old on a table tomb at Ketton, and get the impression, and blow the dust off it, and put it inside the second book. Then she said, Mrs. Hibbert, we must get it down again, and it must go back exactly as it was, because if it does not, somebody will make it good properly, and then there will be nothing under it but new lime. There is no cause to whisper, my dear. There is nobody in this house at all. I know it, said Lavinia. I have been whispering for an hour, and I cannot help it. They got it down. It took longer than the lifting, and it very nearly went wrong twice, and afterwards Mrs. Hibbert sat on the bottom step of the flight in her black bombazine, with her cap askew, and laughed until she cried, which she had not done since the old master died, and the 2 of them drank the housekeeper's sherry in the housekeeper's room at 5 in the afternoon, and the girl walked home in the dark. The 10th to the 14th Thursdays were the chimney pieces and the sundries, and they were the dullest work of the whole of it, and took the longest, because sundries always do. The sills of 5 windows, the thresholds of 3 doors, the landings, the copings, and a run of moulded work round the foot of the screen that no one had ever mentioned to her, and that she found by putting her hand along it in the dark. On the 14th she was very nearly taken. Mr. Danby had come home in the night from Stamford, and got up early, which he never did, and came down through the hall at 11 in the morning, with his hat on, going out to the stables, and she heard the door at the head of the stair, and had 4 seconds, and went sideways behind the 4th column of the screen, and stood there with the tape in her fist, and the rule in her pocket and her cheek against the polished shaft. He walked the length of the hall 4 feet from her. She could hear the creak of his boots and the tap of the quizzing glass against his waistcoat button. He stopped in the middle of the paving and turned round once, slowly, looking up at the whole of it in the way he did when there was nobody by to be told about it. And then he said, aloud to nobody, in a voice she had not heard him use before or since, well, then he went out, and the door shut, and she stood behind the column for a count of 200, and then came out and put away her tape, and went home, and did not go back for 11 weeks. The 15th to the 18th were the checking. She measured the paving a 3rd time and the stair a 2nd, and found 2 errors of her own, both in the sundries, both against herself, and corrected them. The 19th was in the November of 1818, and it was nothing at all, a single sill in the saloon that she had entered on the slate and never carried to the book, and a last walk round the hall with her hands behind her back and nothing in them, to see it once more as a whole. It took 11 minutes. Mrs. Hibbert let her out at the garden door and said, "Is that the end of it, then?" "That is the end of the measuring, ma'am." "And what comes after the measuring?" "Nothing, until something does," said Lavinia, and they shook hands, which neither of them had ever done before, and she went home in the dusk with the book in her basket under the mending, and did not set foot in that house again for 8 months. Her life, by the spring of 1819, had the shape that such lives take when they are not interfered with. She was governess to the 2 younger daughters of Colonel Standish at Netherwold Grange, a square red house with a gravel sweep and a cedar, 1/2 mile from the church. Colonel Standish had come home from the peninsula with a stiff hip and an opinion of most people, and he had engaged her chiefly because his wife had heard her read aloud at a parish meeting, and had said afterwards that the girl spoke like a gentlewoman and looked like she could be trusted with the silver. He had never regretted it, and had never said so. Mrs. Standish said so about twice a week. Miss Kitty Standish was 13 and could not sit still. Miss Adela was 11 and could sit still for 4 hours together and did, which was a different sort of trouble. Between them they had, in 3 years, learned French enough to be teased in it, arithmetic enough to keep house, a fair round hand, the rivers of England, the kings and queens in order with their dates, and the entire habit, which was worth more than any of it, of finishing a thing they had begun. Lavinia had £28 a year, a room over the schoolroom with a view of the kitchen garden, her washing, and the use of the library, which contained 140 volumes of sermons, and a full set of the Gentleman's Magazine, going back to before she was born. She was not unhappy. She was aware that the situation of a governess is one in which a woman may be perfectly comfortable and perfectly alone at the same time. And she had decided early that of the two facts, she would attend to the first. On fine Saturdays, she walked. Everybody in Netherwold knew where Miss Musgrave walked, because she walked to buildings. She walked to Ketton and looked at the church tower, which is one of the finest in England, and which her great-grandfather had helped to repair. She walked to Tickencote and looked at the arch. She walked to Empingham and to Ryehall, and once, on a whole holiday, as far as Stamford to look at the front of Brown's Hospital, and came back with a rubbed impression of a mason's mark on a scrap of paper, taken with the flat of a lead pencil the way her father took them. She had a second book for those, ruled and dated, with the marks copied out and beneath each the place, the date, and any guess she could make of the hand. There were 311 marks in it by that spring. She had begun it at 15 because her father had said, half in joke, that somebody ought to, and she had gone on with it after he died for no reason she could have defended in company. It was the only thing she did that had no use whatever, and it was the thing she would have kept if she had been obliged to give up everything else. The Standish girls knew about it and thought it eccentric and were secretly proud of it. Miss Kitty had once told a visiting cousin that their governess could look at a church and say who built it, which was not true, and Lavinia had corrected her. She could sometimes look at a stone and say who cut it, which is a much duller thing and only useful to about 9 people in the kingdom. Of Wyvern Park, she did not speak at all. Mr. Sylvester Danby had come into the estate in the January after Sir Everard died. He was a cousin, a second cousin in fact of the half-blood, and there had been a fortnight in November when nobody was entirely certain that he was the heir at all, and he had come up from Bath, where he had lived for 20 years, on an income that had never been quite equal to his notion of himself. He was then a man of 46, and by 19 he was 50 and had thickened. He had a florid, heavy-jowled face, thinning sandy hair combed forward over the temples in a fashion 10 years gone, and pale eyes set rather too near together, and he wore a primrose yellow waistcoat under a bottle green coat, and a quizzing glass on a black silk ribbon, which he raised to look at people who had spoken to him. He was not a cruel man in the way that would have made a story. He was a man who had waited a long while for consequence and, having got it, meant to have the whole of it every day, and who could not bear that anything in his house should have been anybody's before it was his. He had gone through the papers at Wyvern in his first month with an attorney at his elbow, and had discovered what such men always discover, that a great estate is a machine for owing money. There were bills at Stamford and bills in London. There was an annuity to a former housekeeper. There was a nurseryman's account for 400 trees. And there was, in the steward's certificate book, a series of payments on account to a mason. What he did with the mason was the simplest thing he ever did. He told Mr. Locke, the steward, that the account was closed. When Mr. Locke observed that it could hardly be closed, since the work had never been measured, Mr. Dombey replied that he had inspected the hall himself, and that any fool could see it was a pavement, and that he was not going to be bled by a country stone cutter over a floor his cousin had thrown away a fortune on. And when Mr. Locke, who was an honest man and slow, said that there were articles under seal, Mr. Danby said that if there were articles they might be produced, and if they were not produced, there were none. That was in the February. Her father died on the 22nd of that month, 3 days after the letter reached the yard. She had always understood, without ever being told in so many words, that the two things had walked into the house together. She had gone to Mr. Locksley at Stamford in the April, when she was 19 and had £90, and had sat in the outer office among the deed boxes for 40 minutes, and then in the inner one for 20. Mr. Locksley was then a man near 60, thin, upright, silver-grey, in gold-rimmed spectacles and a black coat, who had drawn the articles himself and remembered the day. He had been perfectly clear with her, and perfectly kind, and what he told her was not what a girl of 19 wants to hear. The covenant, he said, was good. The heir was bound, but the heir would defend, and a defence of that kind was not a thing of a fortnight, it was a suit, and a suit meant an attorney and counsel and the measuring and the witnesses, and if it went as such things went, 3 years and £400 before anybody said anything final. He put it to her plainly. She had £90. If she spent it in the first year of a suit, she would be a pauper in the second, and the other side knew it, and knowing it was half their case. It is not justice, Miss Musgrave, he had said. It is arithmetic. I am obliged to give you the arithmetic first, and I am sorry for it. She had asked him one question. She had asked whether the right of it went away by waiting. He had told her that a covenant under seal ran for 20 years, and that if she did nothing at all for 19 of them, her right on the 20th would be exactly what it was that morning, and that in the meantime she had better find a way to live. Then I will wait, she said, and stood up, and thanked him, and went and found a situation. She had never told him what else she had decided in the outer office among the deed boxes, that a debt which cannot be sued for can still be proved, and that proof, unlike money, could be got a Thursday at a time. So she had waited 4 years, and had measured 19 afternoons, and had said nothing to anybody, and by the spring of 19, she was the only living person who knew, to the inch, what was owing on the great hall at Wyvern Park. There were 2 things she did not know that spring. The first was that Mrs. Hibbert had kept, in the pocket of her apron and afterwards in the drawer of her own press, every scrap of paper from the old reign that the new master had ordered burned, on the principle, which she had held for 31 years, and would have gone to the block for, that papers in a house are the houses, and a housekeeper is not a fire. The second was that the new master had determined to open the hall. He had been 5 years in the house, and had done nothing with it. Now, in his 50th year, with his daughter to bring out, and a hunger on him that Bath had never fed, he had determined that the county should see the thing at last. There was to be a ball at Wyvern Park on the last Thursday in July. The great hall thrown open, the screen and the stair lit, an awning over the sweep, a band from Stamford, and a card sent to every house within 12 miles that had a name worth having on a card. By the middle of June, there was nothing else spoken of in 3 parishes. Mrs. Standish, who had been 11 years at Netherwold Grange, and had never once crossed the threshold at Wyvern, received her card on a Monday morning and read it aloud twice at breakfast. Colonel Standish said that he had no opinion of Danby, and would go, since a man might as well look at a floor he had heard about for 5 years. Miss Kitty, being 13, was in agonies at not going. Miss Adela, being 11, asked what a screen was, and was given a lesson upon the orders of architecture that lasted until the bell went. And then, in the 3rd week of June, Mrs. Standish came into the schoolroom with the card still in her hand and a particular expression on her face, and said that she had been thinking, and that as the girls were too young for the dancing, but not too young to see such a thing once in their lives, they should go for the first hour and stand at the side of the stair, and that Miss Musgrave should take them and bring them home at 11. Lavinia looked at the map she had been pinning up and did not turn round at once. "You are very good, ma'am," she said, "but I am not sure I am a proper person to be at Wyvern." "Nonsense, you will be with the girls. My father worked there, ma'am." "I know he did," said Mrs. Standish comfortably, "and Colonel Standish says he was the best workman in the county, and I am sure nobody there will think twice about it. You will wear your grey, and you will keep near the door, and you will bring them home at 11. There was nothing further to be said that would not have been a scene, and Lavinia did not make scenes. She said yes, ma'am, and finished pinning the map, and went upstairs at 9 that night, and looked for a long while at the grey muslin hanging behind the door, and at the darned shawl on the chair, and thought about the loose step at the turn of the stair, which had never been grouted, and which had been made loose 4 years ago by a man who had never seen the hall lit. Then she took the sheepskin book out of the work basket and read her own last entry, which she had not looked at in 11 months. Some of the measure 2,140 feet. She put it back under the mending, and blew out the candle, and slept without any difficulty at all, because she had learned in her 20th year that a thing which is going to happen on the last Thursday in July does not become smaller by being sat up with in June. The last Thursday in July came in hot, and stayed hot, and by 8 in the evening the road from Netherwold to the park gates was full of dust and carriages, and boys running alongside to see the lamps. There were 68 people in the hall at Wyvern Park that night, and afterwards a good many more than 68 said they had been there. The hall was the finest room in the county, and everybody said so at the door, and went on saying it for an hour. It was 50 feet by 30, and rose the full height of the house, and the paving ran away from the entrance in squares of 2 colours laid diamond-wise, and the great stair went up at the far end, and turned on a broad landing under a window of plain glass, and the screen of 6 columns stood across the lower end, with the saloon beyond it, and everything, floor, stair, columns, chimney-piece with its carved shell and swag, was of Ketton stone, rubbed and polished until it held the candlelight the way still water holds it, in long soft lines rather than points. Mr. Sylvester Danby stood at the foot of his stair in a bottle-green coat over a primrose waistcoat, with his quizzing glass on its black ribbon, and received the county, and was very nearly happy. Lavinia came in behind Colonel and Mrs. Standish, with a girl on each side of her, in grey muslin with a white collar and a darned shawl, and was announced as nobody, which is the correct way for a governess to be announced, and went where she had been told to go, to the side of the stair by the 3rd column, and stood there. She had not been in the hall since the November before last, and never at night, and never lit. It was a curious thing to bear. She had known the room on her knees with a rule in her hand and dust in her hair, in the flat grey light of Thursday afternoons, in a silence broken only by Mrs. Hibbert's keys 2 rooms away. Now there were 68 people in it, and a band playing above the screen, and light coming off the columns from 100 candles, and every surface she had ever touched was doing exactly what her father had said it would do when he had made her stand at the door once, in the middle of the mess in the second year, and said, "Mark it now, girl, and mark it again when they light it, and tell me then whether it was worth 3 winters." She marked it. She stood by the 3rd column with her hands folded and marked it, and it was worth 3 winters. Then she began, without meaning to read the room. She could not help it. It was how she had been made. She saw at once that the 3rd step from the bottom had been washed with something oily, probably to bring the color up for the night, and that whoever had done it had let it run into the joint, which would show in a year. She saw that the loose step at the turn, the one that had never been grouted because the setting of it had been the last thing, and the last thing was never done, had been packed with mortar by somebody in a hurry that week, badly, with the mortar squeezed proud of the face and wiped instead of cut. She saw a hairline in the cap of the 2nd column that was not a crack, but the natural vent of the bed, and she knew which bed at the upper quarry it had come out of, because her father had argued with Miss Thirlby about that very block for a fortnight. She was still looking at the cap of the 2nd column when the 2 ladies in front of her began to talk about her. They were not unkind either. That was the thing she remembered afterwards. They were 2 comfortable women from beyond Empingham who had been told who she was by somebody at the door, and they discussed her for perhaps 2 minutes with the frankness of people talking in front of a chair. That is the Standish girl's governess, the mason's daughter. Musgrave? Was it not Musgrave who did all this? He did the setting, I believe. Danby had the marble from London. Ah, well, it is a pity for her. Still, she has a very respectable situation. Lavinia's face did not alter at all. She had been in service in one form or another for 3 years, and had heard herself discussed a great many times, and had learned that the correct answer is to be looking at something else, and to go on looking at it. She was still looking at the cap of the 2nd column 10 minutes later, when the room, in the way a full room does, opened a lane between her and the foot of the stair, and Mr. Sylvester Danby came down it with 4 gentlemen and 2 ladies about him, showing his hall. He was telling them what it had cost. He had been telling people what it had cost all evening, not the sum, which he did not know, but the fact of the sum, which is a different and more agreeable possession. He rapped the column with his knuckle as he passed it, the way a man raps a horse. "Every stick of it out of Italy and London," said Mr. Danby. "My cousin would have nothing local," and he was right. "You do not get this," the knuckle again, "from a country yard." Somebody said something about the stair. "The stair is the thing," said Mr. Danby. Varden of Piccadilly. 16 months in the working, I am told, and shipped up in straw, and then his eye, going round his own room the way an owner's eye goes, found the grey muslin by the 3rd column, and stopped, and he lifted the quizzing glass on its black ribbon and looked through it, and knew her, and was pleased. He did not lower his voice. He did not trouble to lower his voice, and the band had come to the end of a set at that moment, and the noise in the hall was the noise of 68 people not talking. "Ah," said Mr. Danby, "and here is the stonecutter's girl." The 2 ladies in front of her turned round. So did the gentleman. So, in a widening ring, did a very fair proportion of the county, because there is nothing in this world so quick as a room understanding that something is about to be said. "Come, do not be shy," said Mr. Danby. "You are very welcome. Look your fill." Your father set what better men cut, and was paid for the setting to the last shilling, and I will say for him he made a tidy job of the laying down. It is a pity he filled your head with the notion that there was more owing. There is not a name in this house, my dear, but ours. But you may look, and welcome, and if you find a step out of true, you shall tell me of it. There was a laugh. It was not a loud laugh, and it was not everybody, and afterwards several of the people who made it were ashamed of it, and one of them wrote a letter about it that was never sent. But there was a laugh, and it went round the hall and came back off the stone, because the stone was hard and polished, and gave it back the way it gave back the candlelight, in long soft lines rather than points. Lavinia Musgrave stood by the third column, with her hands folded, and said nothing. She did not flush. She did not curtsy, which would have been an answer, and she did not look away, which would have been another. She looked at Mr. Sylvester Danby for about the length of 2 breaths, with an attention that a good many people in that hall remembered a great deal longer than they remembered the laugh. And then she turned her head unhurried and looked at the stair. Miss Kitty Standish, who was 13 and had gone scarlet to the ears, took hold of her sleeve. Lavinia moved her hand a little, without looking down, and Miss Kitty let go. Miss Musgrave, said Mrs. Standish, arriving at speed from the direction of the saloon with her fan going like a wing, the girls are tired. Yes, ma'am, said Lavinia. In a moment, if you please. And she went, not out, which is what everybody expected, and not away from him, which is what he expected, 3 steps forward and to the left, to the foot of the great stair, and stood on the bottom tread with her hand on the moulded end of it, and looked up the flight to the turn, and then down at the tread under her own shoe for perhaps a quarter of a minute in front of them all. What she was doing was reading the joint of the 3rd step where the oil had run. What it looked like, to 68 people, was a young woman in a mended shawl standing in the middle of the finest room in Rutland, taking possession of a staircase. Then she came back to Mrs. Standish, and said that she was ready when the young ladies were, and they went out through the ring of them to the door, and Colonel Standish, who had come up from somewhere with his stiff hip and a face like the peninsula, gave her his arm across the sweep which he had never done in 3 years, and handed her into the carriage after his daughters as if she had been his sister. Nobody said anything until the gates. Then Miss Adela, who was 11, said, "Did he say we might look at it?" "He did," said Lavinia. "Was it true, what he said about your papa?" "No," said Lavinia. "Then why did you not say so?" Mrs. Standish began, in the dark, to say that Adela was not to ask questions, and Lavinia said gently that it was a fair question and deserved an answer. "Because he was in his own house, my dear, with a great many friends in it. And I had nothing in my hand," she said. "A thing that is true on Thursday is still true on Friday. It keeps better than most things. But it wants proving. And proving is done with papers and rods, not with talking in a hall." "Have you got papers?" said Miss Kitty from the other corner. Lavinia looked out of the window at the dark trees going by, and thought of the tin box on the shelf of the press in her room over the schoolroom, with her father's freedom papers in it, and her grandmother's marriage lines, and one part of an indenture cut wavy at the head, folded in 4, that no living soul had asked her for in 3 years and 4 months. "Go to sleep, Kitty," she said. She did not weep that night either. She sat by the window until the house was quiet, with the shawl still round her, and did a thing she had not done since her father died. She went through the whole of the hall in her head, from the door to the screen, stone by stone, the way he had taught her to walk a job at night when he could not sleep, and found, as she had known she would, that she could have told any court in England what was under the mortar of every joint in it. Somewhere near 2 o'clock she got up, quite calmly, and lit the candle, and took down the tin box, and opened it, and put the 2 parts of the thing she needed side by side on the table, the indenture and the sheepskin book. Then she took out a sheet of the Colonel's writing paper, and wrote a letter to Mr. Locksley of Stamford, in her fair round hand, of 11 lines, asking for the favour of half an hour on Saturday, on a matter of business of her own. Mr. Locksley's office at Stamford was up a passage off the High Street behind a door with a brass plate that had been polished so long and so hard that the letters had gone shallow. Lavinia was there at 10 on the Saturday, having walked in from Netherwold and changed her shoes in the churchyard, which is a thing that people who have never been poor do not know is done. The clerk took her name in and came back and said Mr. Locksley would see her directly, and she sat among the deed boxes with the names of half the county painted on their ends, and read them, and was calm. He had aged 3 years' worth in 3 years. He came round the desk to hand her to a chair, which he had not done when she was 19, and he looked at her over the gold rims for a moment before he sat down himself. "You have grown up, Miss Musgrave." "I have grown older, sir. I am not sure that is the same thing." "It is a good deal of it." He put his hands together. "I heard about Thursday." "I supposed you would. Everybody in this town has heard about Thursday. Mr. Danby has done in an hour what I could not have done in a year of letters, which is to make 68 people wonder aloud whether there was an account after all. He said it without any pleasure, as a man states a fact of weather. Well, you have come to ask me the question you did not ask me when you were 19. "No, sir," said Lavinia. "I have come to answer it." And she put on the desk, in front of him, the folded skin of vellum and the sheepskin book. He did not touch either at once. He looked at the vellum for a while, at the wavy indenting along the top edge where it had been cut apart from its fellow 8 years before, and he said, in a different voice, "You have had that all along." "Since my father died. It was in the tin box in the yard office. Nobody ever asked me for it." "Nobody ever asked you for it," Mr. Locksley repeated. He drew it towards him and opened it out flat with his fingertips, and put on a second pair of spectacles over the first, and read down the lines to the place where his own clerk's hand had written, 8 years since, for himself, his heirs, executors and administrators, and he stopped there, and read it again, and let out a breath through his nose. "And this," he said of the book, "that is the measure." "Whose measure?" "My father's, to the autumn of 15. "And mine after." Mr. Locksley looked up sharply. "Yours, 19 afternoons, sir, between the April of 16 and the November of last year. Mrs. Hibbert had the goodness to let me in at the garden door. I measured the paving square by square and cast it at home. I girt the mouldings of the stair with tape, profile by profile, because that is the honest way. I measured the screen, the caps, the bases, the 2 chimney pieces, and the sundries. It is entered in my hand under his, and the sum is at the foot, and I will swear to every figure in it." There was a silence in the office of about 10 seconds, which in an attorney's office is a long while. Then Mr. Locksley took off the outer spectacles and said, "Miss Musgrave, do you know what you have been carrying about in a work-basket? I know what it is worth if it is proved, and nothing at all if it is not. You have been carrying a proved debt under seal against a landed estate, and a measure to support it taken by the only person living who could take it." He put the spectacles down. "Sit still a moment, I am going to think, and I do not think quickly any more." He thought for 4 or 5 minutes, during which she looked at the deed boxes and did not fidget. "Very well," he said at last. "I will tell you the arithmetic again, because it has changed, and it is only fair you should have the new arithmetic as you had the old. It is still a suit if he chooses to make it one, and a suit is still 3 years, and it is still £400. But there are 3 matters on the other side of the account that were not there in 16. He put up a finger. "The first is that you have the counterpart, and he does not know you have it. His whole position for 4 years has been that if there were articles, they might be produced. That was a safe thing to say. It is no longer a safe thing to say, and the moment he learns it, he will be a different man in this business." A second finger. "The second is the measure. His attorney will tell him, Pringle is not a fool, that when the work is on the ground and the articles say measure and pay, the only real question in the cause is the quantity, and the quantity is a matter for 2 measurers and an umpire, not for a jury and not for 3 years. If he is well advised, he will go to a reference, because a reference is cheap and quiet and out of the newspapers. A third. And the third is Thursday, Miss Musgrave, which I would not have wished on you for £100, but which is now a fact. Miss Danby has stood up in his own hall and told the county that he had the whole of it from a London yard. That is not a thing he can unsay. If it turns out to be untrue, he is not merely a man who has resisted an account, which any gentleman may do. He is a man who has told 68 people a thing that is not so, about a floor they were standing on. He put his hand flat on the vellum. Now what do you want? I want it, in your words, and I want it to be the whole of it, because I have known clients ruin themselves by asking for one thing and meaning another. Lavinia had had 11 days to think of the answer, and it came out in the shape she had made for it. I want the measure taken properly and publicly, sir, by men whose word will stand, in the hall itself, with the articles read out before it begins. I want it said in front of witnesses whose stone it is and whose hand cut it. After that I want the balance that the articles say is due, and not a shilling more, and I do not want damages, and I do not want an apology, because an apology from that gentleman would be worth exactly what it cost him. You want the reading aloud, said Mr. Locksley slowly. I want the reading aloud. Why? Because he did not lower his voice, she said. Mr. Locksley of Stamford, who had been 41 years in the profession and had heard a great many people explain what they wanted, looked at her for a moment and then wrote 3 words on the paper in front of him and underlined them. Then we shall have to be very correct, he said, and rather slow. Are you able to be? I have been slow for 4 years, sir, so you have. He drew the book towards him. Leave these with me. No, I shall give you a receipt for them, and they will go in the strong closet, and you will not carry them about the country any more. If that book were to fall in the beck, Miss Musgrave, we should have no cause at all. The first letter went out from the office on the Monday. It was 3 sentences long, and it was a masterpiece of its kind. It presented Mr. Locksley's compliments to Mr. Sylvester Dombey, referred to the articles of the 9th of April 1811 between the late Sir Everard Danby, Baronet, and Josiah Musgrave, Mason, deceased, and requested the favour of an appointment at which the work might be measured on the ground in accordance with the said articles, the counterpart whereof was in the writer's hands. The counterpart whereof was in the writer's hands. Mr. Locksley read the sentence aloud to his clerk twice before he sealed it, with the pleasure of an old man who has been waiting years for the chance to write one line properly. The reply came on the Friday, from London, from Mr. Pringle. And it was a great deal longer. It denied that the late Sir Everard had ever entered into articles under seal in the terms alleged. It denied, if he had, that any balance remained due, the whole having been discharged by payments made on account, receipt whereof was admitted. It denied that the work described was the work of the deceased Musgrave, the greater and more valuable part of the same having been executed by an eminent house in the metropolis, and the deceased having been employed as a setter only. It observed that the claim was stale, being now upwards of 8 years from the date of the alleged articles. It observed further that Mr. Danby was informed that the claimant was a young woman in a situation of dependence, and that Mr. Danby, though under no obligation whatever, and wholly without admission of any kind, was willing, out of consideration for her circumstances, to pay the sum of £10. Mr. Locksley sent for her on the Saturday and read her the whole of it, and then handed her the sheet so that she could see it in the writing, because he had learned that people believe their eyes. £10, said Lavinia. £10. It is meant as a kindness by Mr. Pringle and as something else by his client. Do not be angry. I am not angry, sir, I am reckoning. She gave the letter back. £10 is about 4 days of the work at the schedule rates. My father had 11 men on that job at the height of it, and paid them Saturday nights out of his own pocket for 3 years, and never once was a man short. Then we refuse. We refuse. But I would rather we did not refuse in a way that lets him say we refused a fair offer. Mr. Locksley smiled for the first time in the interview. Miss Musgrave, he said, you have the makings of a very disagreeable opponent. He wrote back accepting nothing, denying nothing, and offering, in the most obliging terms in the language, a reference, each side to name a measurer, the two to name an umpire, the articles and the schedule of rates to govern, the measure to be taken on the ground at Wyvern Park, the award to be final and to be made a rule of the court, and each side to bear its own costs. It was, as he explained to her, a trap made entirely of politeness. To refuse a reference was to insist on a suit. To insist on a suit was to spend £400 of his own money to fight a woman with 90, and Miss Danby, who had come into an estate that was a machine for owing money, had not £400 to spend on being right. Pringle held the letter 3 weeks. Then, in the last week of August, he wrote agreeing to the reference, subject to 2 conditions, both of which Mr. Locksley had foreseen, and one of which he had wanted. The first was that the claimant should produce her counterpart of the articles at the reference, and not before, which was mere fencing. The second was that no book, note or memorandum made by the claimant herself should be received in evidence upon the quantities, the same being the private paper of an interested person made after the death of the workman, and without notice to the estate. Mr. Locksley put the letter down and looked at the ceiling for a while. He means to take your book away from you, he said. It is well done. If I were Pringle, I should have written it myself. And can he? Upon the measure? He can try, and he may very well succeed, and if he does, we are thrown back upon the rods on the day. he took off his spectacles. Which means, Miss Musgrave, that everything now stands upon two questions, whether two sworn measurers, working from the articles and the schedule, and nothing else, come to the same figures you came to in 19 Thursday afternoons, and whether, when they are standing in that hall, there is anything in it that will tell them, without you and without your book, whose hand cut the stone. Lavinia sat quite still for a moment. Then she said, "There is." What she told him then took 20 minutes, and Mr. Locksley, who had drawn conveyances for 41 years, and had never in his life thought about the underside of a step, listened to the whole of it without once interrupting. She told him that every banker mason in that district cut his own mark into the bed face of the stone he worked, not on the face that showed, but on the face that was bedded down in the mortar, and would never be seen again. She told him it was not vanity, but bookkeeping. The marks were how the day's work was claimed and tallied when the measure came. She told him that her father's mark was a chevron with a bar across the point, cut deep, always in the same corner, and that he had used it since he was 21, and had cut it into the beds of stones in 11 churches and 2 market halls and 1 gaol. She told him that a London statuary yard did not cut marks of that kind at all, and never had, because a London yard worked to a different system entirely, with a foreman's ticket and a number in chalk. And she told him, last, the thing that mattered. The loose step at the turn was never grouted, sir. It was the last thing to be done, and it was not done, because the house went into black in the November, and my father was dead in the February. Somebody packed it with mortar in a hurry before the ball, and wiped it instead of cutting it, which any mason would see from the door. That step is not bedded. It is sitting on 2 packings of slate and a fillet of soft mortar not 4 months old. Mr. Locksley said, very carefully, meaning what? Meaning that 2 men and a crowbar can lift it in 3 minutes without injury to it, and set it down again after. And under it, on the bed face, in the left-hand corner as you face the flight, there is a chevron with a bar across the point, and beside it the quarry's own mark for the upper bed at Ketton, and under that, because it was the last step of the last flight of the largest job he ever did, my father cut the date. There was a pause. You have seen it, said Mr. Locksley. I have seen it. On the 9th Thursday, when Mrs. Hibbard and I lifted it with the coal shovel and the fire irons, and were both nearly ruined for life, said Lavinia, I put the impression in my second book with the flat of a pencil. But I do not want the impression, sir. I do not want anything of mine to be looked at that day at all. Let Mr. Pringle keep my book out. Let them lift the step themselves, with their own men, in front of everybody, and let the first person to see what is under it be his own measurer. Mr. Locksley took his spectacles off and polished them for a long time on his handkerchief, and put them on again. Miss Musgrave, he said, I am obliged to warn you that you are behaving like a lawyer, and that it is not usually a compliment. The reference was signed in the 2nd week of September. Each side named a measurer. Mr. Locksley named Mr. Ridpath of Oakham, a heavy-set man of 56 with grey side whiskers, who had been a mason himself for 30 years before he took to surveying, and who was known throughout the county to be honest, deaf in one ear, and impossible to hurry. Mr. Pringle, from London, named Mr. Gunnell of Peterborough, a thin, bald man with a manner like cold soup, who had made his reputation cutting builders' bills down to the bone for the county magistrates. and who had never in his life been accused of generosity to a workman. Mr. Locksley was very pleased with Mr. Gunnell. "They think they have got a knife," he told her. "They have got a set of scales. He will pare us to the quarter-inch, and he will do it in front of witnesses, and when he has done it his figure will be worth 3 of any figure of ours. Let him pare." The two of them named as umpire Mr. Sowerby, architect, of Stamford, a courteous, dry, precise man of 60, who had built 2 churches and a bridge and had known both parties' fathers. The day was fixed for the 14th of October at Wyvern Park, in the hall, at 10 in the forenoon. And then, because the reference was signed and the day was fixed, and there were 5 weeks in which nothing whatever could be done, the county began to talk. It talked for 5 weeks. It talked at Stamford Market and at the Oakham Sessions and in every drawing-room between Empingham and Uppingham, and what it chiefly said was that Danby had put his foot in it at his own ball, and that the mason's girl had stood there and taken it, and that there was to be a measuring. Lavinia heard almost none of it, because a governess hears nothing, and she went on hearing nothing, very deliberately. She did the girls' French at 9 and their arithmetic at 11, and walked with them at 3, and marked the map of the Baltic, and kept her hands from shaking on precisely one occasion, which was the Sunday Mr. Danby came to church at Netherwold for the first time in 2 years, and sat in the great pew and looked at nobody. Mrs. Standish had a nervous week in the middle of September, during which she twice began a sentence about whether it was quite the thing for a young person in a family to be engaged in a matter of law, and twice did not finish it, because Colonel Standish looked up from the Gentleman's Magazine both times. The 3rd time he finished it for her. "It is entirely the thing," he said. "The girl is owed money by a man who has denied it in public. If she were a man of 50, nobody would say a word. Adela, take your elbows off the table." That was the whole of the Standish deliberation on the subject, and it was worth more to Lavinia than she ever told them. It was in the last week of September, on a Saturday at Ketton, that she met the Duke of Halstock. She had walked over to see Mr. Thirlby at the quarry on Mr. Locksley's business about the dispatch book. The upper quarry at Ketton lay open to the sky in 3 great steps of pale gold, with the derrick and the crane at the top of it and the saw sheds below, and the noise of it carried 1/2 a mile. Mr. Thirlby was a bull of a man of 60, who had known her since before she could walk, and who had wept at her father's grave, which she had not. He had the books. He had every book since 1802, because a quarry that does not keep its dispatches is a quarry that gets paid twice for nothing and once for everything. "Wyvern," said Mr. Thirlby, running a black thumb down the column. "Wyvern, Wyvern, there is your father's name against every load, my duck, from the June of 11 to the September of 15, and the beds noted, and the cube, and Ned Follett's mark where he carted it. 91 loads. And I will tell you what is not in this book, and that is 1 single load going the other way to London, nor 1 single load coming up from London, neither, because there never was one, and if there had been one I should have seen the wagons on that road, and so would every man in this village. Will you say so on the 14th of October, Mr. Thirlby? I will say so on the 14th of October, said Mr. Thirlby, in the hall, in front of the gentleman, in my own coat, and I will bring the book, and if that Bath-bred article says 1 word to you in my hearing I shall want holding. Then I shall want you not to be held, sir, but to be exceedingly civil, said Lavinia. Civility is worth more to me that day than temper. Temper is what he is hoping for. Mr. Thirlby laughed until he had to sit down on a block. She came out of the office into the sunlight and found a gentleman standing at the head of the steps, looking down into the workings with his hat in his hand, and a groom holding 2 horses at a distance, and she stopped because he was between her and the gate. He was a tall man of about 36, lean and broad in the shoulder, with dark brown hair cut short, grey eyes, and a well-cut dark blue coat, and he had the air, which she recognized at once and had seen perhaps 4 times in her life, of a person entirely at ease who is nevertheless attending to something with his whole mind. He said, "I beg your pardon. Am I in your way?" "No, sir. I am, though. Everyone is always in everyone's way at a quarry." He moved, and then said, without any change of tone, "Do you know why they are taking that bed in slices instead of squaring it out?" Lavinia looked down at the face he was looking at, and answered him before she had time to consider whether a governess in a grey gown ought to be answering a strange gentleman about quarrying. "Because the bed runs thin at the north end, and there is a clay vent through it, about 9 feet in. If they squared it out, they would lose the whole of the good stone above the vent when it fell. Cutting it in slices, they get their steps and their sills out of the top, and lose nothing but the shivered stuff at the bottom." There was a pause of exactly the right length. "Thank you," said the gentleman gravely. "I have been standing here for a quarter of an hour making up a much worse answer than that." He put his hat on, and then took it off again. "I am Halstock," he said. "I am the man who has been pulling his own chapel to pieces at Bourne Ashby these 2 years, and cannot get an honest word out of anybody about it. Every surveyor I bring down tells me what I want to hear, and the last one told it to me for 40 guineas. They generally do, your grace. You are Miss Musgrave. I am. Thirlby told me about you a fortnight ago, and I did not attend properly, which was stupid of me." He looked at her for a moment with perfect steadiness and no curiosity whatever, which she found, and thought about afterwards for a long time, to be the most courteous thing anybody had done to her in 3 years. "May I ask you a question of business? I do not know the etiquette of it, and I would rather offend you honestly than manage you." "You may ask me anything of business, sir. Will you measure my chapel?" Lavinia said, "After a moment, I am a governess, your grace. You are a governess on 6 days, and I am asking for the 7th, which I am told is legally mine as much as anybody's. I want the south aisle measured, and the state of the ashlar reported on by somebody who is not afraid of me, and does not want anything from me. My steward will attend you the whole time, and my mother will give you your dinner, and I shall pay you what I paid the last man, which was 40 guineas, and I shall consider it cheap if you tell me the aisle is sound, and cheaper still if you tell me it is not. 40 guineas is a great deal too much." "Miss Musgrave," said the Duke of Halstock, "I have just been told by a person in a grey gown, in under 9 seconds, the thing I could not get out of a professional man in a quarter of an hour. Let us not begin by disputing which of us is the worse judge of value." She went to Bourne Ashby on the first Saturday in October with Mr. Locke's cousin driving her in a gig, and she was there 7 hours, and she reported that the south aisle was sound in the wall and rotten in the parapet, that the ashlar had been reset in the 1780s by a man who had bedded it face-bedded instead of natural-bedded, which is why it was shaling, and that the whole of it would have to come down and go back the right way up, and that anybody who told him otherwise was either ignorant or comfortable. The Duke read it twice, and paid her the 40 guineas, and did not call on her, and did not write, and did not come to Netherwold for 5 weeks. She thought about that afterwards a great deal. 2. The 5 weeks before the 14th of October were the busiest of her life, and almost none of the business was hers. It began with Mrs. Hibbert, who sent word by the fishmonger's boy that if Miss Musgrave should happen to be walking on the Thursday, she might happen to walk past the back lane at 4, and that there was no need for anybody to be told about it. Lavinia happened to be walking on the Thursday. The housekeeper came out to her at the corner of the kitchen garden wall in her black bombazine, with the keys at her waist, looked up the lane and down it, and put into her hands a parcel done up in a pillowcase and tied with tape. "I am not to be asked what is in it," said Mrs. Hibbert, "and you are not to open it in this lane. And if anybody says to me, 'Did I give you anything?' I shall say, 'Certainly not,' and I shall say it to the bishop if I am put to it. My old master died in that bed with his spectacles on. In the March the new one told me to have every paper in the steward's room burned in the yard, and I had them burned in the yard, and I stood by while it was done, and there was a very great deal of smoke. Now go home, my dear, and go the long way." The parcel opened on the schoolroom table at 11 that night, with the door locked, and Miss Adela's atlas laid over half of it, in case anybody came, held 4 things. The first was the surveyor's certificates, 6 of them, on stiff paper, each signed by the man who had had the care of the works before he went off to Ireland in 14, each certifying that Mr. Musgrave was entitled to receive a sum on account of works executed at the Hall, and each endorsed on the back in a shaky old hand, paid E.D. the 2nd, was the steward's fair copy account for the years 11 to 15, in which the 3 payments stood in their places, in a column headed "On account of the Hall works," not on account of setting, not on account of labor, but on account of the works, which is the phrase the articles used and no other. The third was a bundle of tradesmen's letters of no consequence whatever, and the fourth was a single sheet, folded once in the same shaky hand as the endorsements, dated the 28th of October, 1815, 12 days before Sir Everard Danby died in his bed. "Musgrave," it said, "I am told you have finished all but the sill and the loose step, and I am glad of it, though I shall not come out to see, the weather being what it is, and I being what I am. We will take the measure in the spring when the mortar has had its winter. Do not let them hurry you over the grouting of that step. It is the last thing you will do in this house, and I would have it right. I am an old man, and I say what I please. It is the only handsome thing that has been done here in my time, and I know very well what it cost you to do it, and I do not mean the money. My cousin at Bath will have the whole of it after me, and will not know a column from a cow, and there is no help for that. Yours, E. Danby." Lavinia read it 4 times, and then sat with her hands flat on the table on either side of it for some while, in a room with 1 candle in it, and the house asleep. It was not evidence. Mr. Locksley said so at once when she took it in on the Saturday. It proved nothing that the certificates did not prove better. An umpire would give it no weight upon the quantities, and Pringle would object to it in a breath. He read it twice himself, all the same, and blew his nose rather longer than was necessary, and said that they would put it in the bundle at the back, where nobody could say it had been hidden, and that if it was never reached that would be no great matter. It is not for the reference, Lavinia agreed. It is for me. Quite so. And it is a curious thing, Miss Musgrave, which you will observe more than once, if you live long enough, that the man who was actually there is nearly always civil, and the man who came after is nearly always not. The rest of the 5 weeks was people. Mr. Locke, the steward, who had told Mr. Danby in the February of 16 that the account could hardly be closed, and had been told to mind his own department, walked over to Stamford on his own legs on a Sunday afternoon to say that if he were asked at the reference what the payments were entered as, he should answer truthfully, and that if he were turned off for it, he had a sister at Melton and could go there. Mr. Locksley told him that a man who spoke the truth under a reference was in no danger whatever, which was not entirely accurate, and gave him a glass of sherry. Amos Cardwell, who had been her father's banker mason for 19 years and was now working for a builder at Uppingham, came over one evening with his wife and sat on the edge of a chair in the Standish's servants' hall, and turned his hat round and round, and said that he had cut the caps of the 2nd and 5th columns, and the whole of the saloon chimney-piece, that his mark was a double loop, and he would know it at the bottom of a well, and that there were 4 other men living who had worked on that hall, and he had spoken to 3 of them, and they would all come. Simeon Trigg is at Peterborough, and he says he will come, and he will not come, said Amos, because Trigg never come to anything in his life without being fetched. But I shall fetch him. Ned Follett the carter was 71, and brought his waybills in a flour sack. He could not read them. He knew what was in every one of them. The Reverend Miss Bramwell, who had christened her, told her that the parish register recorded her father's burial and his trade, and that if it were of any use to the gentleman he would bring the book itself, in his own hands, and lay it on the table, and then, being a nervous, kindly, threadbare man of 50 who had never in his life been mixed up in anything, added that he supposed there could be no objection to a clergyman attending a measuring, and that he should very much like to be there. There were also the letters from Mr. Pringle. There were 9 of them between the middle of September and the 10th of October, and they were, Mr. Locksley said, a liberal education in the profession. They objected to the umpire and withdrew the objection. They required the counterpart to be produced at the office of a third party for examination, and when Mr. Locksley agreed by return and named the office, discovered that the examination would not after all be necessary. They gave notice that Mr. Danby would attend by counsel, then that he would not, then that he would. They asked, in the most delicate language conceivable, whether in view of her situation, the claimant would prefer that the reference be held at Stamford rather than at Wyvern Park. He does not want it in the hall, said Lavinia. He does not want it in the hall, agreed Mr. Locksley, which is now the only reason we require for having it in the hall, though I shall write him 400 words about the necessity of measuring the work where it stands, and he will know exactly what I mean, and he will not be able to say so. At the end of September, Mr. Danby had the stair put in order. A builder came over from Peterborough with 3 men and pointed the joints of the whole flight, and washed the paving with a soda solution, which Mr. Ridpath afterwards said was the sort of thing that made him want to take up another trade, and looked at the loose step at the turn, and told Mr. Danby that it was not bedded at all, that the packing under it was slate and soft stuff, not 4 months old, and that to make it good properly it would have to be lifted, cleaned off, rebedded on a full bed of lime, and left a fortnight for the mortar to take up. Mr. Danby asked him how long a fortnight was, in October, with a reference on the 14th. The builder said a fortnight was a fortnight, so the step was left as it was, with a fresh filly of mortar wiped along its face to make it look like the others, and the builder went back to Peterborough and told the story in a public house in a way that reached Oakham by the Friday, and Mr. Ridpath by the Saturday, which is how the county was in those days. Through all of it, Lavinia taught. Miss Kitty and Miss Adela had their French at 9 and their arithmetic at 11, and in the first week of October they did the counties of England and the principal rivers, and in the second week they did compound proportion, which Miss Kitty said was invented by a wicked person. Lavinia heard their reading, mended their frocks, walked them to the church and back, and did not once in 5 weeks speak to them about the 14th. On the Sunday before it, Miss Adela, who was 11 and observant, and had said nothing for 5 weeks, asked her at the schoolroom window whether she was frightened. Lavinia considered the question, because it was a fair one and deserved an answer. "No," she said, "I am not frightened, and I will tell you why, and you may keep it, because it is the only useful thing I know. Everything that will be decided on Thursday was decided 8 years ago by my father with a chisel, and 4 years ago by me with a 2-foot rule, and neither of us can be argued with now. The gentlemen will come and they will measure. And the measure is what it is. I have never yet met a stone that could be talked round. Papa says Mr. Danby is very angry. I dare say he is. Anger is what people have instead of figures. What have you got?" 2,140 feet, said Lavinia, and a great deal of help I did not ask for. She wrote out that evening for her own use a paper of what she would say if she were asked anything, which was 1 page, and ended with the sentence, "If I do not know, I shall say that I do not know." She had never in her life given a figure she could not prove, and she was not going to begin on the 14th of October in front of the county. Her father had been 30 years in the trade, and had put down thousands of measures, and had never once been wrong against a check, and she had been taught by him from the age of 9, and the one lesson under all the others was that a measure is not an opinion. Then she went to bed, and slept, and got up on the Monday and did the French at 9. In the last fortnight before the 14th, Mr. Sylvester Danby did 3 things, and all 3 of them were the sort of thing a man does when his attorney has stopped writing him comfortable letters. The first was an offer of £100, brought over privately by a neighbour. The neighbour was a well-meaning gentleman from beyond Empingham named Mr. Hollingbourne, who had been at the ball in July, had been one of the people who laughed, and had been sorry about it ever since, in the mild way of a man who intends to go on dining where he has always dined. He came to Netherwold Grange on a Tuesday, asked for Colonel Standish, was given sherry, and explained that he came as a friend to both sides, and that Mr. Danby, though of course admitting nothing whatever, was willing to put an end to a business that could do no good to anybody, and would pay £100 down, and there need be no measuring and no gentlemen standing about in the hall, and it would all be forgotten by Christmas. Colonel Standish sent for her, which was correct, and sat in his own chair while it was said again, which was kind, and said nothing at all himself, which was better than either. Lavinia heard the whole of it standing by the window with her hands folded. "Mr. Hollingbourne," she said, "I am obliged to you for coming, and I do not doubt you mean it well. Will you carry an answer?" "With pleasure, ma'am." "Then say to Mr. Danby that the sum owing is not a matter of opinion, that it will be whatever 2 sworn measurers say it is, and that if they say it is £100, I shall take £100 and be content. And say to him, but say this exactly if you please, sir, because I do not wish to be understood to have said anything else, that I am not selling my quiet, because it is not for sale, and I am not selling my father's name at all." Mr. Hollingbourne, who was 50, and had never in his life been spoken to in that manner by a governess, carried the answer, and told the story afterwards at 3 dinner tables, each time a little more in her favour, so that by the 2nd week in October it had reached the form in which it survived for 30 years in that neighbourhood, that Danby had offered her £100 to go away, and she had told him her father's name was not for sale. The second thing was a letter to Colonel Standish. It came on the Thursday, and it was a masterpiece of the other sort. It regretted the necessity. It observed that Mr. Danby had always held Colonel Standish in the highest esteem. It ventured to suggest that the Colonel might not be entirely aware of the position in which his household stood. A young person in his employment, and having the care of his daughters, being engaged in a litigation of a most public character against a gentleman of the county, and that Mr. Danby, in the friendliest spirit, felt bound to point out that such a connection could not but be talked of, and might be thought by some to reflect upon the family. Colonel Standish read it twice at the breakfast table, and then read it aloud to his wife, in full, in the voice of a man reading out a bill of lading, and then went to his desk and wrote his reply in 4 lines, and rang the bell and sent it over by a groom before the tea was cold. "Sir, Miss Musgrave has the care of my daughters. She is teaching them arithmetic. I am obliged to you for your concern. I am, sir, your obedient servant, H. Standish." He never mentioned it to Lavinia. Mrs. Standish mentioned it to her within the hour, being unable to hold it, and cried, and said that she had been very silly in September, and hoped she was forgiven, and Lavinia said that there was nothing whatever to forgive, and that Miss Kitty's French verbs were a disgrace. And the 2 of them were perfectly comfortable together for the remaining 14 months. The third thing was a letter from Misty Pringle, and it was the cleverest of the 3. It suggested, with every expression of delicacy, that the claimant's personal attendance at the reference would serve no purpose, that the measure would be taken by the arbitrators from the articles and the schedule, and could not be affected by anything she might say, that her book was excluded, and that Misty Danby, having regard to the painful nature of the proceeding for a young woman in her situation, and being anxious that she should be spared, would raise no objection to her remaining away, her interests being fully protected by her attorney. Mr. Locksley brought that one out to Netherwold himself rather than trust it to the post, and sat with her in the Standish's morning room with his hat on his knees. "He wants you out of the hall," he said. "Yes, he is quite right that you can do nothing there. You will not be sworn, you will not be asked, you have no book any more, you will stand against a wall for 6 hours and be looked at by 40 people, and several of them will be looking to see whether you cry, because that is what people are. It is a hard morning, Miss Musgrave, with nothing in it for you but the standing. Mr. Locksley," she said, "when he said what he said in July, was I obliged to be there? You were not. But I was there. He had the whole county to hear it. He shall have the whole county to hear the other thing, and he shall have it in the same room and off the same stone. She smoothed her skirt over her knee. I am not going to speak, sir. I am not going to look at him. I am going to stand by the door with my hands folded and let the gentleman work. But I will be in that hall when the articles are read, if I have to walk the 4 miles and stand the whole day without my dinner. Mr. Locksley put his hat on and said that he would draft a refusal in the most obliging terms in the language, and that it would give him more pleasure than anything he had written since the first letter in July. On the Sunday before the reference, the Reverend Miss Bramwell preached at St. Chad's on a text out of Deuteronomy. A perfect and just weight shalt thou have. A perfect and just measure shalt thou have. He was a nervous man, and he had told nobody he meant to do it. And he did not once look at the great pew, which was empty, or at the free seats at the back, where a governess sat between 2 girls in bonnets. He preached for 19 minutes on the plainest possible ground, that weights and measures are named in Scripture more often than almost anything else, because they are the place where a man's religion is actually found out. That the world is full of persons who would not steal a shilling and will beat down a bill, and that a measure is not a bargain, and the man who alters it alters something that does not belong to him. Half the parish came out of that church knowing exactly what they had heard, and nobody could have written down a word that was actionable, which the colonel said afterwards was the best piece of soldiering he had seen in a pulpit in his life. The last 3 days were nothing. She heard the girls' French at 9. She did compound proportion at 11 with Miss Kitty, who got it entirely right on the Wednesday, and was so astonished that she had to be given a glass of water. She walked to the church and back at 3 with both of them, in the good hard October light, past the horse chestnut where the boys were out with sticks. On the Wednesday evening she washed and ironed her white collar herself in the laundry after the servants' supper, and mended the shawl where it had gone at the shoulder, and brushed the grey muslin, and put out her shoes, and Mrs. Standish came down in her wrapper at 10, and said, would she not have the sprigged one, or the blue, or would she take the loan of a bonnet, with a good ribbon, because it would be a great room, and a great many people. Thank you, ma'am, no, said Lavinia. They will be measuring my father's work tomorrow. I should like to be dressed as his daughter, and not as somebody else's guest. She slept, though not much, and got up at 6, and was ready at 8, and the colonel's carriage took her over at 9:30 with Colonel Standish beside her, in his regimentals, which nobody had asked him to put on, and which he wore for the whole of that cold, bright day, standing against the wall of another man's hall. At the park gates, the lodge-keeper's wife came out and bobbed to her, which had never happened in her life before. And in the avenue, walking up under the beeches in 2s and 3s because there was no room for the carts, were the masons of Ketton in their good coats, 11 of them, with their hats in their hands and their mallets carried down at their sides, on their way to see what the gentleman would make of a measure they had cut with their own arms 8 years before. The 14th of October came up cold and bright, with a white mist on the park that burned off by 9, and left the whole of it washed and glittering, and the beeches along the avenue at their best. There were 19 persons in the hall at Wyvern Park who had a right to be there, and about 40 more who had not, and by 10:30 nobody was troubling to turn anybody out. The arbitrators had a table brought down from the steward's room, and set across the lower end under the screen, with 3 chairs behind it, and a green baize cloth on it, and the fire lit. Mr. Ridpath of Oakham sat on the right with his rods and his tape and his slate, deaf in one ear, in a brown coat. Mr. Gunnell of Peterborough sat on the left, thin and bald and cold, with a folio of his own paper ruled in 6 columns. Mr. Sowerby the umpire sat between them, dry and courteous, and laid his watch on the baize. Mr. Locksley stood at the end of the table with his bundle tied in faded pink tape. Mr. Pringle, who had come up from London and did not like the country, stood at the other end with 2 bundles and a clerk. Behind Mr. Pringle stood counsel, a young man from the circuit named Mr. Felton, who had been 11 months at the bar and looked at the hall a good deal more than at his brief. Mr. Sylvester Downby stood on the 3rd step of his own staircase, where he could be seen, in a bottle green coat over a primrose waistcoat, with the quizzing glass on its black ribbon. Against the wall on the entrance side were the people. Mr. Locke, the steward. Mr. Thirlby from the quarry with the dispatch book under his arm. Amos Cardwell and 3 other masons in their good coats, scrubbed to the wrists. Ned Follett with his flour sack. The Reverend Mr. Bramwell with the parish register in a green baize wrapper, holding it as though it were the collection. Mrs. Hibbert, who had a perfect right to be in that hall, and had made sure of it by carrying in the coal scuttle. Colonel Standish, with his stiff hip, having said at breakfast that a man might as well see a thing done properly. 8 or 9 gentlemen from the neighbourhood, who had been at the ball in July, and had come, though none of them would have put it so, to see the end of a sentence. And near the door, in grey muslin, with a white collar, and a darned shawl, with her hands folded, and nothing whatever in them, stood Lavinia Musgrave. Mr. Sowerby began at 3 minutes past 10. He said that the parties had referred to him, and to his brother arbitrators, the ascertainment of the quantity and value of the works executed at that house, under certain articles, and the balance, if any remaining, due, that the award would be final, and would be made a rule of the court, that he would have no speeches, and that they would begin, as such references properly began, and as he was glad to see the parties had agreed, with the reading of the instrument. Mr. Locksley, produce your counterpart. Mr. Locksley untied the pink tape, and laid the vellum on the green baize, and opened it out. Mr. Pringle, you will wish to inspect it. Mr. Pringle came round the table and inspected it. He had been instructed for 4 years upon the footing that no such document would ever be seen, and he inspected it for rather a long while, at the indenting along the head, and at the seal, and the tag, and at the signatures, and then he straightened up and said, in the flat voice of an honest professional man, who has just had a great deal explained to him at once, I do not dispute the execution. Then it will be read, said Mr. Sowerby. The whole of it, Mr. Locksley, if you please. Slowly there are persons in this room who will hear it only once, and Mr. Locksley of Stamford, who was 64 years of age, and had drawn the thing himself in a back office 8 years before, put on his 2nd pair of spectacles, and read the articles of the 9th of April 1800, and 11 aloud in the hall they had built, from the first word to the last, in front of them all. It took 11 minutes. The hall was very well suited to it. It was a room made to carry a voice, with the stone giving it back off the columns in long soft lines, and there was no other sound in it at all except once, near the beginning when Ned Follett shifted his flour sack, and once near the end when somebody by the door drew in a breath. The end of it was this, and the said Sir Everard Danby, for himself, his heirs, executors and administrators, doth hereby covenant, promise and agree with the said Josiah Musgrave, his executors, administrators, and assigns, that he the said Sir Everard Danby, his heirs, executors, and administrators, shall and will well and truly pay, or cause to be paid unto the said Josiah Musgrave, his executors, administrators, or assigns, the balance of the said work so ascertained by measure as aforesaid, within 6 calendar months next after the taking of the said measure. Mr. Locksley took off the outer spectacles. Mr. Sowerby said, "Thank you." "Mr. Pringle, does your client say that instrument was discharged?" "My client says the whole was discharged by the payments on account. Then he says a sum was paid without a measure having been taken, against an obligation payable by measure. Very well, it is a defence, and we shall see what it comes to. Mr. Ridpath, Mr. Gunnell, you have the schedule of rates. Before you go to your rods, there are 2 matters." He turned over a paper. "The first. Notice has been given Mr. Locksley that no book or memorandum of the claimant's own making is to be received upon the quantities. I have considered it with my brother arbitrators, and the objection is a good one. The book is not received." "As your honour pleases," said Mr. Locksley, without a flicker. "The second," said Mr. Sowerby, "is my own, and neither party has asked for it, and either may object. I am told that this young woman has measured this hall herself. Her book is out. But it has occurred to me that a measure is a fact and not an opinion, and that this reference will occupy the better part of a day, and that it would be of some interest, to me at least, and I am the umpire, to know at the end of it whether she was right." He held up a folded sheet of paper. "I propose that Miss Musgrave shall now write her total of the superficial measure upon this paper, that it shall be folded, sealed by Mr. Pringle with his own seal, and kept by him in his own hand until the arbitrators have agreed their figure, and opened then. It cannot prejudice the measure, since no one but she will know what is in it. Mr. Pringle, do you object?" Mr. Pringle was a shrewd man in a difficult morning, who had already been surprised once, and he did the shrewd thing, which was the wrong one. "I do not object," he said, "so long as it is understood that the paper is no evidence." "It is no evidence of anything on earth," agreed Mr. Sowerby. "Miss Musgrave, be so good." She came forward to the table. The room turned round to look at her, and she did not appear to notice it. She took the pen from Mr. Sowerby, dipped it, and wrote 9 words, and no more, in a round clear hand on the middle of the sheet, and folded it twice, and gave it to Mr. Pringle, who sealed it with the seal on his watch chain, and put it in his breast pocket. Then she went back to the door, and stood against the wall with her hands folded, and the measuring began. It went on for 5 hours and 20 minutes, and it was the dullest thing the county had ever watched with its whole attention. They began with the paving. Mr. Ridpath and Mr. Gunnell took it in squares from the door end, 2 rods and a tape and a piece of chalk, calling the dimensions to Mr. Sowerby, who wrote them, and where the diamond pattern ran under the screen they argued for 20 minutes about whether the half squares at the margin were to be measured as squares or as their true content, and settled it out of the schedule. And Mr. Gunnell won, and the total went down by 4 feet. They did the stair riser by riser. Mr. Gunnell girt the mouldings himself, with a strip of tape, which is slow work on 3 and 40 steps, and twice made Mr. Ridpath do it again after him, and once, on the 11th step, found a quarter of an inch, and would not let it go for 6 minutes. They did the screen, 6 columns, their bases, plinths, and caps, and a long dispute about whether the polishing of the shafts was to be paid at the rubbed rate or the wrought rate, which Mr. Sowerby decided against the claimant. They did the chimney-piece in the hall with the shell and the swag, which took 40 minutes and required a ladder, and the plain one in the saloon, which took 9. They did the sunrise, sills, landings, thresholds, copings, and a length of coping outside the garden door, which Mr. Gunnell said was not in the articles at all, and which came out of the account entirely. At every stage Mr. Gunnell paired, and Mr. Ridpath let him pair, and Mr. Sowerby wrote. Twice Mr. Danby came down off his step, and said something to Mr. Pringle, and twice Mr. Pringle said something back that made him go up again. At 12:15 they came to the turn of the stair, and Mr. Ridpath, who had been a mason for 30 years before he was a surveyor, put his knuckle on the loose step and then his boot heel on it, and stood up and looked at Mr. Sowerby. That step is not bedded, sir. What is under it? Slate packings and a soft fillet 4 months old at the outside, wiped and not cut. It has been made to look like the others by somebody who has never bedded a step in his life. It cannot be measured for setting where it is not set. Then lift it. Mr. Danby said from the stairs, in a voice that came out higher than he meant it to, "There is no occasion whatever to be pulling my staircase to pieces. Then it will be measured as unset and struck out of the account," said Mr. Sowerby, "which is against the claimant, not against you, Mr. Danby, and I am at a loss to see your interest in it. Mr. Ridpath, have you a man?" There were 4 masons against the wall in their good coats. Amos Cardwell and a Ketton man took their coats off, and it was done in 3 minutes with a crowbar and a folded sack, as she had said it would be. And the step came up on its edge and was walked over and laid face down on the sack, in the middle of the paving, in the middle of that hall, with 40 people standing round it in a ring. The bed face of it came up to the light of the tall window, pale gold and rough from the saw, and there in the left-hand corner as you faced the flight, cut deep, 1.5 inches across, was a chevron with a bar across the point. Beside it was the quarry's own mark for the upper bed. And under that, in the workmanlike sloping figures, a mason cuts when a job is finished, spelled out plain to anybody who came within 4 feet of it, was the last day of the work, in the 9th month of the year 1815. Nobody said anything at all for a moment. Then Mr. Sowerby said, "Mr. Gunnell, you are the gentleman instructed for the estate. Will you tell me, if you please, what that mark is?" Mr. Gunnell of Peterborough, who had paired her by 4 feet, and by 1/4 of an inch, and by a length of garden coping, and who was a thoroughly disagreeable man, and an entirely honest one, went down on one knee on the paving in his good black trousers, and looked at it for a long time. "It is a banker mason's mark, sir," he said, getting up. "It is cut in the bed, which is where they cut them and where nobody sees them. It is not a London mark. No London yard cuts them. They work to a ticket and a chalk number. And it is not a setter's mark either, because a setter does not touch the bed face. The man who cuts that mark is the man who worked the stone. Whose mark is it?" "I do not know whose it is," said Mr. Gunnell. "There are 4 masons standing against that wall who will." They came one at a time and looked at it and said the same 4 words, and Amos Cardwell said them with his hat in his hand. Mr. Pringle asked, correctly and quietly, whether one mark upon one step proved anything as to the remaining 2,000 and odd feet. Mr. Ridpath said that it would be a simple matter to lift 3 more in the paving at the margin, where they were bedded on lime and could be lifted and reset the same day. They lifted 3. There were 2 more chevrons and a double loop. At 20 minutes to 2, Mr. Pringle asked leave to call his own witness, who had been brought up from London at the estate's expense, and had been sitting all morning by the door with his hat on his knees. A foreman of the yard of Varden and son of Piccadilly, a competent grey man of 60 in a decent coat, who had been sent for to prove that the works were the yards. Mr. Sowerby put the question himself. Did your house execute the paving, stair, screen, or chimney pieces of this hall? The foreman looked round the hall with real professional pleasure, and said that he had been admiring it since 10 o'clock, and that his house had never touched a stone of it, that it was not their stone, not their moulding, and not their manner of working, and that if it had come out of their yard, he would have known it across a field. Did your house supply anything whatever to this building? We supplied 1 marble hearth slab, and a set of fire cheeks for the saloon in the January of 13, sir, said the foreman. £11 and some shillings. It is in our book. I have brought the book. There was a sound in the hall then from the 40 people who had no right to be there. Not a laugh, exactly. The noise a room makes when a thing that everybody has known for 5 weeks becomes a thing that has been said. Mr. Sylvester Danby went out of the hall by the door under the stair at about 10 minutes to 2, and did not come back into it, and was afterwards said by his own butler to have gone up to the library and sat there. The arbitrators finished the measure at 20 past 3, and cast it up, and agreed their figures at 4, and Mr. Sowerby wrote the award in his own hand at the green baize table, with the whole room watching him do it. The quantity of the superficial measure, as ascertained by the arbitrators and agreed between them, was 2,139 feet and a half. The value at the schedule rates was £3,816 and 4 shillings. Against it stood the 3 payments on account, admitted on both sides of £200, £500 and £800, £1,500 in all. The balance found due to the personal representative of Josiah Musgrave, deceased, was £2,316, 4 shillings and 6 pence, payable within 6 calendar months. Then, Mr. Sowerby said, Mr. Pringle. The paper, if you please. Mr. Pringle took it out of his breast pocket, and broke his own seal and unfolded it, and read it aloud in a voice which for the first time that day had something in it that was not professional. 2,140 feet superficial, Lavinia Musgrave. Half a foot in 2,140, and the half foot was the garden coping that Mr. Gunnell had struck out. Nobody applauded, because it was not that kind of room and they were not that kind of people. What they did was turn, all of them, towards the door where the governess in the grey gown was standing with her hands folded, and Mr. Ridpath of Oakham, who was 56 and deaf in one ear, and had been measuring buildings since before she was born, put down his rod on the green baize and took his hat off to her across the length of the hall. It was 10 minutes past 5, and nearly dark when they came out of the hall at Wyvern Park. The award was signed and in Mr. Sowerby's pocket, and the fair copies would be made at Stamford on the Friday. And the step at the turn had been reset on a full bed of lime by Amos Cardwell and a Ketton man before they left, without anybody having asked them to do it, and without anybody offering to pay them for it, because, as Amos said, putting his coat back on, he was not going home leaving a stair like that behind him at his time of life. Mr. Gunnell of Peterborough came across the paving to her at the door, thin and bald and cold, with his folio under his arm. "I took 4 feet off you at the margin, ma'am, and I was right to," he said, "and a length of coping, and I was right to do that as well." "You were, sir, yes." He looked at her for a moment. "I have been at this 31 years, and I have never yet checked a private measure that came out inside a foot. Good evening to you." Mr. Ridpath said nothing at all, having said it with his hat in the middle of the afternoon. Mrs. Hibbert was in the passage by the garden door with a candle, as she had been on 19 Thursdays. And she did not say anything either. She took hold of both of Lavinia's hands and held them hard for about 4 seconds, and let them go, and stood back against the wall to let her pass. And that was the whole of it, and the two of them were very good friends for 11 years afterwards, and Mrs. Hibbert lived to hold the Duchess of Halstock's daughter on her knee in the housekeeper's room at Bourne Ashby. Outside, on the sweep, in the cold, the masons of Ketton were waiting with their hats off. Lavinia went down the steps to them and shook hands with every one, and asked after Emmos's wife, and asked Simeon Trigg, who had been fetched exactly as predicted, and had spent the day at the back saying nothing, and going red, whether he was still cutting his tea with the stroke sloped. And Simeon Trigg said he was and always would be, and had the whole of that story from her in front of the others about how she had learned his mark at 12 years old off a coping stone at Ketton, and had known it ever since, and it was told about him for the rest of his life, and he never once minded it. Then the Colonel handed her into the carriage, and they drove home under the beeches with the lamps lit. She was very tired and rather cold, and she had eaten nothing since 7 in the morning, and it was that, she said afterwards, and not anything else, that made her put her head back against the cushions in the dark, and find that her eyes had run over at last, without any noise. On the 2 miles between the park gates and the church, which Colonel Standish observed, and did not remark upon, and never mentioned to anybody in his life. At the Grange there was a fire in the schoolroom, and Mrs. Standish had had the supper kept back, and 2 girls in their nightgowns were sitting on the stairs where they had no business to be. "Well," said Miss Kitty. 2,139 feet and a half, said Lavinia, taking off her bonnet. Miss Adela, who was 11, and had done compound proportion that week, worked it out on her fingers on the banister and said, "You were half a foot out." "I was." "Which half a foot?" "The coping outside the garden door," said Lavinia. "It was not in the articles. Mr. Gunnell was quite right to strike it, and I shall tell you why while you drink your milk, and then you are both going to bed, and tomorrow at 9 we are doing the verbs." The award was made a rule of the court in the Michaelmas term, and there was no appeal, because there is nothing to appeal against in a measure. Mr. Sylvester Danby paid in the March, 3 weeks inside his 6 months, by raising the money on a mortgage of the Empingham Farms at 4.5% through a house at Stamford. which meant that the hall was at last paid for out of the land it stood on, as his cousin had always intended it should be. Mr. Pringle conducted the payment with perfect correctness. Mr. Locksley gave a receipt in full and endorsed the counterpart, and made a note in his daybook that in 41 years he had never had a client who wanted less than she was entitled to, and that he had had 400 who wanted more. Mr. Danby went back to Bath in the May and let Wyvern Park to a family from Leicestershire, and the hall was much admired by them, and by everybody who came after them, and there is no record that he ever showed it to anybody again. What the county said about him afterwards was not violent. It was worse than that. It said that he was the gentleman who had told 68 people in his own hall that the stone came from London. Lavinia Musgrave was 25 that spring, and had £2,316, 4 shillings and 6pence, which was more money than her father had seen in his life, and rather more than the whole of Netherwold turned over in a year. She did 4 things with it, and did them slowly, and consulted Mr. Locksley about every one. She bought back the yard at the corner of the Stamford Road at Ketton, with the office and the saw shed and the crane, and let it at a rent to Amos Cardwell, who had been her father's banker mason for 19 years, and had gone to work for a builder at Uppingham, because there was nothing else, and who now took 2 apprentices of his own, and put his double loop into the beds of stones in 3 counties for another 22 years. She put a stone up in the churchyard at Ketton, over her father and mother, a plain slab of the upper bed, worked by Amos, with their names and dates and the one word Mason, and nothing else, no verse, no urn, no weeping figure. She was at some pains over the lettering, and had it cut twice, the first cutting being, in her judgment, half a shade too fine for the stone. She settled £100 on the parish school at Netherwold, on condition that the Reverend Mr. Bramwell should have the spending of the interest, and should never be obliged to ask a committee for anything, and she kept the rest, in the funds, at Mr. Locksley's direction, and did not spend it, and did not tell the Standishes how much it was, and she went on teaching Miss Kitty and Miss Adela for another 14 months, at £28 a year, until Miss Kitty was 15, and went to her aunt at Bath, and Miss Adela was 13, and went to school, which was the term for which she had engaged herself, because, as she observed to Mrs. Standish, who had been very kind to her and cried about it, one does not leave a thing in the middle merely because one has come into money. She also began in a modest way to be sent for. It got about. It got about first among the masons, which is the way such things properly get about, and then among the clergy, who are always repairing something and never have the money for it, and by the spring after the reference there were perhaps a dozen people in Rutland and South Lincolnshire who had discovered that if you wanted to know whether your tower was moving, or your ashlar shaling, or your builder's bill honest, there was a young woman at Netherwold Grange who would come out on a Saturday with a 2-foot rule and tell you the truth in writing for 3 guineas. She did 7 churches, 2 bridges, a market hall, and the whole of a gentleman's stable block at Ryhall in that year. Twice she reported that there was nothing whatever the matter, and returned 2 of the 3 guineas. Once she told a builder to his face, in front of his own men, that the wall he had put up at Uppingham was face-bedded, and would shale in 9 winters, and he said that a woman had no business to be talking about beds, and Mr. Ridpath of Oakham, hearing of it, wrote to the churchwardens that he had been at the Wyvern reference, and that if Miss Musgrave said a wall was face-bedded, the wall was face-bedded. The wall came down in the summer, in daylight, with nobody near it. The Duke of Halstock called at Netherwold Grange for the first time in the November after the reference, which was 5 weeks after it, and asked for Colonel Standish, and sat with him for half an hour, and then asked whether he might be permitted 3 minutes of Miss Musgrave's time upon a matter of business. In the schoolroom, with the door open and Miss Adela at the table, the matter of business was the parapet of the south aisle at Bourne Ashby, which had come down and gone back up the right way, at a cost of £1,100, exactly as she had told him in October 12th, and he had come, he said, to report it to her, since she had reported to him, and it seemed to him that the traffic ought to run both ways. He came again in the January about the west window, and in the February about nothing very defensible, and in the March he brought his mother. The Dowager Duchess of Halstock was 71, deaf, direct, and had buried a husband and 2 brothers, and had no patience left for anything. She looked at the schoolroom, and at the girls, and at the map of the Baltic, and at Lavinia, and she said, in the carriage going home, in the voice of the deaf, which carried to the stable yard, that the young woman had better manners than 3/4 of the House of Lords, and that Crispin had better get on with it before somebody in Lincolnshire did. He did not get on with it. He went on exactly as he had begun, for 14 months with the door open and the business real. A chapel, a parapet, a bridge at Ketton that the county surveyor had condemned, and that she said was sound in the arch and rotten only in the spandrel, and was right. He never once, in all that time, offered her anything she had not earned, and he never once spoke of her circumstances, and he never, as she told the Dowager Duchess long afterwards, and it was the highest thing she ever said about him, he never once behaved as though the reference had been her misfortune rather than her work. He asked her in the May at Netherwold in the drawing-room, with Mrs. Standish having gone out of it on a transparent pretext, and Colonel Standish having taken his stiff hip into the garden and stayed there. Miss Musgrave. I had not, when I rode over to Ketton in September a year and a half ago, to be told in 9 seconds what 40 guineas had not bought me, expected this morning. I have loved you, with what dignity I could, and with what patience your year required, since the afternoon you handed me a paper, telling me that my own chapel had been built wrong side up by a man who was comfortable. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have loved you constantly since that day, to do me the honor of becoming my wife. You have known me too short a time to be in love with me yet. I shall not press you on that. I ask only that you consider the proposal at your own time, and answer me upon your own terms. If your answer is no, the work continues unchanged, and the proposal shall never be raised again. Lavinia looked at him for the length of 2 breaths, in the way she had looked at Mr. Sylvester Danby across the hall at Wyvern, and it was the same look, and it did not mean the same thing at all. Your Grace, she said, I shall. The banns were read in the parish church of St. Chad at Netherwold on 3 Sundays in the May and June of 1821 by the Reverend Mr. Bramwell, who lost his place in the book on the first Sunday and had to be helped by his clerk, and did not lose it on the other 2. They were married there on the 14th of June, which was chosen because it was the anniversary of nothing at all, and she said she had had enough of anniversaries. The church at Netherwold holds 211 people, and there were rather more than that, standing at the back and in the porch, and out among the graves. Colonel Standish gave her away with his stiff hip, having asked for the office himself in a single sentence, and gone red doing it. Miss Kitty Standish, 16, and Miss Adela Standish, 14, attended her. Mr. Locksley of Stamford, 66, sat in the third pew with his spectacles pushed up, and did not attempt to hide anything at all. Mrs. Hibbert came over from Wyvern in a new bonnet. Mr. Thirlby came from the quarry, and Mr. Ridpath from Oakham, and Mr. Locke, and Ned Follett at 73, in a coat borrowed from his son. Amos Cardwell and 11 masons walked from Ketton, and stood along the path from the porch to the gate, in their good coats with their hats off, and as she came out on her husband's arm into the sun they did not cheer, because they were not that kind of people either. They took up their mallets, which they had carried the 4 miles for that purpose, and struck them once, together, on the stones of the path. She stopped, and put her hand out, and touched the nearest man's sleeve, and went on. The Duchess of Halstock did not give up the 2-foot rule. She was Duchess of Halstock for 41 years, and in the whole of that time there was not a scaffold raised on any building of that estate that she did not go up. She measured the works herself for 11 years, until her eyes made it foolish, and after that she sat in a chair at the foot with the book on her knee, and made other people measure them and rade her the figures. 3 generations of masons in that county were paid to the quarter-inch, on the ground, within 6 weeks of finishing, because the woman who settled the accounts had spent 19 Thursday afternoons on her knees at Wyvern Park, learning what it cost a man to wait. She kept the other book too, the Book of Marks, ruled and dated, that she had begun at 15 for no reason she could have defended in company. Her husband had it bound in Stamford in the 2nd year of their marriage, in plain calf, and gave it back to her, with nothing said, and she went on filling it. There were 311 marks in it the year she was married. There were 904 in it the year she died, and it is in a library in that county still, and there is not a name in it anywhere. Only the marks, and the place, and the date, and the hand. The chevron with the bar across the point appears in it 11 times. 1 year and 3 months after the wedding, on the warm gold Sunday morning of the 22nd of September, 1822, their first child, a daughter, christened Hester Margaret, was baptized at the parish church of St. Chad at Netherwold by the Reverend Mr. Bramwell, with the Dowager Duchess of Halstock standing as godmother, and Mr. Locksley of Stamford, who wept openly and did not care who saw it, as godfather. The child was named for a clergyman's daughter who had died at Ketton when her own daughter was 11, and had left behind her a shelf of books and an instruction that the girl was to be taught properly, or not at all. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock at a door at midnight, or with a hired post-chaise turning in at a gate, or with a will read aloud in a cold office to a young woman who had never met the man who made it. And there are, slower than those, longer in the waiting, of the most obstinate patience in the proving. Stories that begin with 9 lines in a mason's hand in a sheepskin book 8 inches by 5, a measure taken on the ground in feet and inches and quarter inches, by a man who never in his life put down a figure he could not stand up in a room and prove. She was in that room. She stood at the door of it in a mended shawl for 5 hours and 20 minutes with nothing in her hands, and let other men's rods say what her own book was not allowed to say, and was wrong by half a foot in 2,140, and the half foot was not hers. And so, on the warm gold morning of the 14th of June, 1821, in the parish church of St. Chad at Netherwold in the county of Rutland, under a sky washed clean by the rain of the night before, Lavinia Musgrave, who had buried her father at 19 with an unmeasured haul standing to his account, and had been laughed at in that hall at 24 in front of 68 people, and had said nothing then, and had gone home, and had lit a candle, and had written a letter of 11 lines, became, by the patient asking of a man who had never once stood between her and anything, the 5th Duchess of Hulstock, and walked out through a double rank of her father's own men, with their hats in their hands and their mallets in their fists, over stone that had been measured at last.